3 young Dracarans stood at the entrance of the human quarter on Cradle Point Station, and not one of them wanted to go inside. Nara was the first to step through. She did it the way she did most things, quickly, before her brain could argue with her feet. Behind her, Breck followed with his hands tucked behind his back, his golden eyes moving slowly over everything, cataloging and filing. Orin came last. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at the walls, and made a sound deep in her throat that was not quite a word. The human quarter smelled like cooked grain and something sweet that none of them could name. The corridors were narrower than the Dracaran sections of the station, which made sense because humans were narrower. The lights were slightly warmer in color, almost amber, which was strange because Dracaran preferred cool white light and had always assumed every species did. The floor had a soft material over it, not hard plating, something that gave just slightly under the foot. Nara pressed her heel down twice, testing it. They padded the floor, Breck said. They pad everything, Orin replied. Their ships have padded walls in the sleeping quarters. I read about it. Why? Orin looked at him. Because they bruise. Breck did not have anything to say to that, so he said nothing. The youth exchange program had been their parents' idea, which was the first reason all 3 of them resented it. The second reason was that it was 2 full weeks long, which was 2 weeks away from home, away from flight practice, away from everything familiar. The third reason was that they had met the human youth participants at the opening ceremony that morning, and the humans were, without exception, very small. Not small the way young ones were small. Small the way adults were small when the species simply did not grow past a certain point. The tallest human at the ceremony had barely reached Nara's shoulder, and she was the shortest of her clutch. They had soft faces and round eyes that came in a strange range of colors, brown and blue and pale green, and they moved in quick, light steps like prey animals that had learned to look calm, but never fully were. Nara had tried to be fair about it. She had stood across from a human girl with short dark hair and listened to her talk about the exchange program with what seemed like genuine excitement, and Nara had nodded at the right moments and used the right words. But the girl had laughed twice at things that were not jokes, and both times Nara had felt a kind of second-hand awkwardness that was difficult to shake. The tour guide, a human man, led them deeper into the quarter now. He talked the entire time. Humans talk constantly, not because they had much to say, Nara thought, but because silence seemed to make them uncomfortable. The guide explained the layout of the quarter, the dining areas, the shared common rooms, the observation lounges. He said the word community 4 times in 3 minutes. Breck fell into step beside Nara and spoke quietly. There are 8 species on this station with military presence. We rank 3rd in overall firepower. The humans rank 7th. I know, Nara said. They rank 7th out of 8, he said again, as if she had not heard him. I heard you the first time. Orin moved up on Nara's other side. They have been members of the Compact for 40 years. They have never been in a major military engagement. They have 1 colony world and a handful of outposts. Their largest ship class is a mid-range cruiser. She paused. My father says they are here because removing them would create diplomatic complications, not because anyone actually needs them. Nara did not reply. She was watching the guide's hands as he talked. Humans used their hands when they spoke. It seemed inefficient. It also seemed, somehow, like they could not help it. The tour continued. They passed a workshop where a human woman was building something out of metal components, her fingers moving with a quick precision that was almost interesting. They passed a medical bay where a human medic was talking to a patient while simultaneously writing in a file and drinking from a container without spilling any of it. Nara watched that for a moment. The multitasking was not remarkable. Any Dracaran could do 3 things at once. It was more that the medic looked completely unbothered by any of it, like being spread across 3 tasks simultaneously was simply the normal state of being. Then the tour turned a corner, and they entered a maintenance corridor that was not on the tour route. The guide paused and frowned and said something about a wrong turn, but before he could lead them back, Nara saw him. He was crouched on the floor beside an open panel in the wall, a human man somewhere in the middle of his years, with gray at the edges of his dark hair and a calm expression that looked like it had been there for a very long time. He had tools laid out beside him in a precise row. He was working on what Nara recognized as an atmospheric regulator, one of the critical systems that kept the station's air breathable across all species sections. The regulator was a significant piece of equipment. On any compact station, a failure in that system would trigger an immediate maintenance crew response, minimum 6 technicians, a department supervisor, and a repair window of at minimum 2 days. This human was alone. The guide began to apologize for the interruption, but the man on the floor simply raised one hand briefly without looking up, the way someone waves off a small concern, and kept working. Nara watched him. He worked without rushing. He checked each connection before moving to the next. His hands were steady. He made a sound twice, a low hum with no particular tune. Not quite music, not quite nothing. After a while he reached into his tool row, picked up a length of wire, bent it at a specific angle without measuring, and fitted it into the open regulator with a soft click. He sat back on his heels and looked at his work for a moment. Then he reached up and closed the panel. He gathered his tools back into their case in the same order he had laid them out. He stood up. He noticed the group watching him and gave a small nod, not embarrassed, not proud, just acknowledging that they existed. Then he picked up his case and walked away down the corridor. The guide checked the regulator's status panel on the wall. It read, operational. How long was he in there? Breck asked quietly. The guide looked at the log. 26 minutes. Breck looked at Nara. Nara looked at the closed panel. Oren was already looking at the door at the end of the corridor, the one the human man had deliberately not opened on his way past, the one marked with warning glyphs that Nara did not recognize. That is a restricted access marker, Oren said, reading it. Human compact military designation. Class 3 restricted. Nara looked at the door. The guide was already moving the group back toward the tour route, talking again, filling the air with words. Breck followed. Oren followed. Nara stood still for one more moment. Then she followed too. But she had already decided that she was coming back. The lock on the restricted door was, in Oren's professional opinion, an insult. She said this quietly, crouched in front of the door panel at the end of the maintenance corridor, her tools out, her expression flat. She had broken into more complicated locks when she was 9 years old, practicing on her father's study door because he kept his best reading material in there. This human compact military class 3 restriction used a 6-digit rotational cipher with a biometric backcheck that was designed to stop humans, whose senses were limited. Dracker and Heat Sight read the residual warmth of the last fingerprints on the keypad in under 2 seconds. Breck stood behind her with his arms crossed, looking in both directions down the corridor. He did this every few seconds, rhythmically, like a machine set to a single task. Nara stood beside Oren and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The lock opened with a soft sound, barely audible, and the door slid back. I want the record to show, Oren said, standing up and putting her tools away, that I said this was a bad idea. The record shows it, Nara said, and walked in. The room was not what any of them expected. It was large, larger than it looked from the corridor, the kind of space that had been deliberately built to serve a purpose rather than fit neatly into a floor plan. The floor was covered in a dense, dark matting that absorbed sound. The ceiling was high. Along one wall there was a rack of equipment, padded gloves, blunt striking implements, resistance bands, things Nara recognized as training tools from their physical education sessions back home. Along the opposite wall there were mounted screens, dark now, and below them a row of benches with storage beneath. In the center of the room, there were hanging structures that Nara recognized as impact bags, the kind used for striking practice. One of them had a crack running along its upper seam, and whatever material it was filled with had been compressed from repeated impact into a shape that was no longer round. Breck looked at the cracked bag. He reached out and pressed his palm against it. It did not give. This is harder than standard training material, he said. It is because they need it to last, Oren said, but her voice had gone a little quieter. Nara had moved to the wall panel. She pressed it, and the screens lit up. They asked for authorization, which she ignored, because the secondary access was on a completely separate pathway from the door lock and was meant to be accessible to any cleared personnel in the room. She found the gap in the system within a minute. Breck came to stand beside her. The training logs went back 11 years. Not for this room specifically, for this cohort of personnel assigned to the human quarter of Cradle Point Station. There were 41 names on the active roster. Nara selected the first one and opened the record. The record showed a standard physical training log. Hours spent. Disciplines covered. Performance benchmarks across time. Nara scrolled through it without much interest until she reached the endurance section. She stopped. The log showed a continuous physical activity record of 22 hours without rest, completed 4 weeks ago. It was classified as a quarterly assessment, meaning this was done every 3 months as a measurement of baseline capability, not as an exceptional event. Nara selected a second name. A different record, different person. The endurance section showed a 19-hour continuous assessment. The note beside it said, recovering from minor injury, modified protocol. 19 hours was the modified protocol for someone who was hurt. Oren had pulled up the injury records separately. She read them with the focused, controlled expression she wore when she was being very careful not to show what she was thinking. Then she said, "Look at this." Nara looked. The injury report was for a training incident 14 months ago. It listed a compound fracture of the lower forearm, 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and severe bruising across 40% of the back. The treatment record showed surgical correction and physical therapy. The return to training date was listed at 6 weeks after the injury. 6 weeks, Breck said. For all of that, Oren said. That is not possible, Breck said. Neither Nara nor Oren told him he was wrong. Because he was not wrong, it was not possible. And yet the record was sitting in front of all 3 of them in clear standard compact notation that had no reason to lie. Nara kept scrolling. She found the pain tolerance assessment files, which were clinical records documenting response to controlled painful stimulus across a range of intensities. She read the calibration notes at the top of the file. The scale used matched standard compact medical assessment tools. A reading of 4 was described as significant. A reading of 7 was described as severe. The human test subjects in these records were routinely completing their protocol at readings of 6 and 7 and marking their own discomfort as moderate. Breck sat down on one of the benches. He sat down the way someone sits when they need a moment to think without falling over. Nara found the video logs. Most were locked, but several had been left open, marked as approved public documentation, likely used for recruitment or program transparency. She opened the first one. It showed a group of humans running. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the environment. The landscape visible through their helmet cameras was gray and white, stone and ice, a mountain range in what appeared to be extreme cold. The humans were running uphill. They had been running, according to the timestamp, for 9 hours. They were not in distress. 2 of them were talking to each other. One of them laughed at something the other said. The laughter came out in white clouds of breath in the freezing air. The timestamp continued. They ran for 3 more hours after that clip ended. Nara closed the file. The 3 of them stood in the room for a long moment and said nothing. There was a particular kind of silence that happens when something you believed without thinking about it turns out to need thinking about, and none of the thoughts that come are comfortable. This was that kind of silence. Then the room's light changed slightly, barely noticeable, the ambient shift of a door opening behind them. Nara turned. The human man from the corridor stood in the doorway, the one with the gray at his temples and the calm expression. He was holding a container of something hot enough to produce a small curl of steam. He looked at the 3 of them, at the open panel on the wall, at the logs still visible on the screens. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked, in a way that was difficult to describe precisely, like a person who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen and had not been certain when it would, but had suspected it would be soon. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him. "You picked a thorough one to start with," he said, nodding at the screen still showing the injury record. He took a slow drink from his container. "The mountain run footage is better, though. More context." Nara said nothing. Breck said nothing. Oren, very carefully, said, "You knew we were here. Maintenance corridor has passive thermal sensors," he said. "I put them in myself. Station security has a 12-minute response lag on corridor alerts. I got here in 4. He looked at the 3 of them without judgment, without performance, simply looking. "I'm Daven. You are not going to report us," Nara said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "Why?" He considered this in the way that suggested the question deserved consideration. Then he pulled one of the benches around and sat down on it, setting his container beside him. Because you opened the door, he said. And that means you're ready to hear what's on the other side of it. He looked at the cracked impact bag. Sit down. This takes a while to explain properly. Nara looked at Breck. Breck looked at Orin. Orin looked at Daven for a long, measuring moment. Then all three of them sat down. Daven did not start where Nara expected him to start. She expected him to explain the training room, the logs, the injury record, the mountain run. She was ready for justifications, the kind of explanations that powerful beings gave when smaller ones accidentally found something that was meant to stay hidden. Instead, Daven started with an animal. He told them about a creature from the human homeworld called a wildebeest. It was a large four-legged animal, he said, that lived on open plains. It was not fast by the standards of the predators that hunted it. It was not armored. It was not dangerous in a direct fight. But it could run for a very, very long time. Nara waited for the point. Daven told them about the predators that hunted the wildebeest. Most of them were faster. Much faster. They could close distance in seconds that the wildebeest could not match. But they could only do it for a short time. Their bodies burned hot, and then they were done. And the wildebeest kept running. Now imagine, Daven said, a predator that could do the same thing. Nara said, humans hunted by running. For most of our history, he said, before we had weapons worth mentioning, we ran prey animals until they stopped. Not because we were fast, because we did not stop. He drank from his container. Our whole body is built for it. The way we sweat, the way our legs are jointed, the way we breathe. We are, from a pure mechanical standpoint, one of the most efficient long-distance running animals our world ever produced. We are also one of the only ones that throws things accurately. He paused. The combination was not great news for everything else on the planet. Breck said, that is your homeworld. This is the compact. The scale is different. The body is the same, Daven said simply. He talked for a long time. He did not lecture. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have thought about something for years and no longer need to organize it before it comes out. It just comes out in order because the order is part of how they think. He told them about pain tolerance, not as a training achievement, but as an adaptive trait, something that humans had developed over hundreds of thousands of years in environments that did not care whether they survived. He explained that the threshold at which a human registered pain as an emergency signal was significantly higher than most compact species, not because humans were numb, but because their evolutionary history had calibrated that signal differently. Pain was information. It was useful, but it was not, for a human, automatically a reason to stop. Orin asked about the injury record, the compound fracture and the cracked ribs and the 6-week return. Daven nodded like that was a fair place to focus. He explained human bone density and healing rates. Then he explained something more specific. He said that for most of human history, there were no doctors. There were no hospitals. If you were hurt, you either healed or you did not. And the ones who healed fastest were the ones who passed that ability on. He said this without drama. He said it the way someone describes a manufacturing process. Just the steps, just the facts. We are not special, he said. That is important to understand. We are not secretly powerful. We are not hiding weapons. We rank 7th in compact military assessments, and that is accurate. We are genuinely limited in most of the ways you think we are. He looked at each of them in turn. But we were shaped by a world that was trying to kill us for a very long time. And some of that shaping does not show up in standard assessment categories. Nara asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since she first opened the training logs. She asked why humans did not talk about this. Why the official compact profile for humanity was so carefully, almost aggressively unremarkable. Why every diplomatic document, every species assessment, every educational summary she had ever read described humans in terms of potential and developing capability rather than what she had just spent an hour looking at. Daven was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when you are small and you are new and everyone around you is significantly larger and older and more established than you are, you have two choices. You can show your teeth, which invites a challenge. Or you can be quiet and useful and let people think what they want to think, which buys you time. He looked at the impact bag with the crack in its seam. We have been buying time. Time for what? Breck asked. Daven smiled. It was a small smile, not proud, not sharp, just there. To become something worth being, he said. We have only been out here 40 years. We are still figuring it out. Orin had been quiet for a while. She was sitting very still, which with Oren meant she was doing the most processing. She asked her question carefully, the way she did when she wanted a precise answer and did not want the question itself to bias the response. She asked, if all of this was true, if humans were shaped by survival in ways that did not translate into standard metrics, then what was the thing that actually mattered? What was the actual center of it? Daven set his container down. He looked at his hands for a moment, not dramatically, just the way you look at something familiar to help you find the right words. Everything I told you tonight is real, he said. The endurance, the pain threshold, the healing, all of it. But none of it is the secret. He looked up. Those are just features, body parts, and what they can do. Lots of species have something like them. Then what is the secret? Nara asked. I'm going to tell you something, Daven said. And you are not going to understand it tonight. You might not understand it tomorrow, but I want you to keep it and think about it, because at some point you will see it, and then you will know I am telling you the truth. The three of them waited. Daven said, the thing that makes humans dangerous is not what we can endure alone. It is what we will endure for each other. The room was very quiet. Watch us, he said. Not in the training logs. Not in the assessments. Watch us when someone we care about is in danger. Watch what we do. Watch how far we go. Watch whether we stop. He picked up his container and stood. That is the part that does not have a metric. He moved toward the door and then paused, not turning back, just pausing. There is a distress relay on this station that goes live if any human outpost in range sends an emergency signal, he said. It has not gone off in a while. When it does, the response happens fast. If you want to understand what I just told you, watch the response. He walked out. The three young Dracarans sat in the training room alone. Breck looked at Oren. Oren looked at the floor. Nara looked at the door Daven had walked through. None of them spoke for a long time. Then Breck said quietly, do you think he is right? Oren did not answer right away. When she did, she said, I think he is describing something that our language does not have an exact word for. And I think that is the first time I have encountered that with a human. Nara said nothing. She was still looking at the door. She was thinking about what Daven had said. Not the facts and not the history and not the training logs. The last thing he said. The part about going as far as it took. The part about not stopping. She did not understand it yet. Not fully. But somewhere in her chest, in a place she would not have been able to point to, she felt the edge of something large. The alert did not sound like an alarm. That was the first thing Nara noticed when it happened. She had expected something loud, something designed to move people quickly through a space with noise and urgency. Instead, the distress relay activated as a tone, low and sustained, and every human on the station stopped what they were doing at the exact same moment, like a word had been spoken that only they could hear. It was early in the station's rest cycle. The youth exchange participants had been in the shared common room, doing very little, the Dracaran group in one corner and the human group in another, not hostile, just occupying separate spaces the way groups do when they are not yet comfortable. The sustained tone came through the speakers, and every human in the room looked up, and then most of them stood, and then most of them left. Nara looked at Breck. Breck looked at Oren. Oren was already moving toward the door. They followed at a distance, which turned out not to matter because no one was watching them. The human personnel on the station had a direction and were moving in it, and the three Dracaran teenagers trailing at the edge of that movement were entirely beside the point. The operations level of the station was not restricted in an emergency, which surprised Nara later when she thought about it. The human design philosophy seemed to be that more eyes in a crisis were better than fewer, that transparency under pressure was worth more than controlled access. They reached the observation level above the main operations floor and pressed against the railing and looked down. Admiral Hess was already there. She was a compact woman with short silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent so many years standing straight that her spine had simply given up arguing. She stood at the center of the floor with a display spread around her, and she was already talking, and the people around her were already moving. The distress call was from a human research outpost called Station Verent, positioned at the edge of compact mapped space. The message that came with it was fragmented but clear enough. A pirate faction, the kind that operated in boundary space where compact law became thin and slow, had moved on the outpost. There were civilians on Verent. Researchers. 41 people, no military personnel, no weapon systems. Nara heard all of this from the observation level. She processed it the way she had been trained to process tactical information, quickly, categorically, estimating outcomes. The nearest compact military asset to Verent was a human cruiser designated Halvern, and it was 40 minutes away at best speed. The outpost had life support for its current population for approximately 6 hours under normal conditions and significantly less under physical threat. The pirate faction had the advantage of position, time, and the fact that they knew the response was 40 minutes away. The math was not complicated. Hess did not appear to be doing the same math. She was doing different math entirely. She scrambled the Halvern, which was expected. She also scrambled 2 patrol vessels that were closer, smaller, not technically combat-rated for an engagement of this size, but faster. She routed them on an intercept course that would put them at Verent in 22 minutes, which was better than 40, even if what they had when they arrived was limited. Then she opened a channel to every human vessel within response range and read a list of coordinates. And that was all she said, just the coordinates and the words, all available, and she left the channel open. Breck leaned close to Nara and said, "She is asking civilian vessels to respond." "She is not asking," Oren said quietly, "watching. She is informing." The difference was real. Nara could see it in the way the channel began populating with response confirmations. Human ships in the area, freight transports, a medical courier, a survey vessel, responding not to an order, but to information and apparently considering the information sufficient reason to change course. They came in one after another on the confirmation list, and Nara counted them. 7 additional vessels within the next 4 minutes. The Halvern engaged its main drive, and the patrol vessels broke from their holding positions, and the civilian ships changed course. And on the display in the operations center, the lines of movement converged on a single point in space, like water running into a low place. Nara watched Hess work. The Admiral moved between stations, not hurrying but not pausing, speaking in short sentences that contained exactly the information her people needed and nothing extra. At one point, a station officer reported that the Halvern's secondary shielding had a maintenance flag from that morning, a known issue that had not been fully resolved, and Hess asked one question: "Can it absorb contact fire?" The officer said probably, and Hess said, "Then we note it and we go." And that was the end of the maintenance discussion. 23 minutes after the alert tone, the first human vessels reached Verent. What happened in the following 40 minutes was not a great military victory. There was no elegant strategy and no overwhelming force. The patrol vessels were smaller than the pirate ships, and they knew it, and they engaged anyway, drawing attention and fire, keeping the pirates occupied and moving, which was all they were meant to do. The Halvern arrived 12 minutes later and changed the calculation. The civilian vessels held position outside the engagement zone, and when the window opened, moved in to evacuate. The Halvern took a hit to its secondary shielding. The maintenance flag had been accurate. The shielding held for one strike and failed on the second, and the damage report that came through to the operations center used words that Nara recognized as significant. The Halvern was hurt. The captain of the Halvern sent a status report and then immediately sent a follow-up saying they were maintaining position to cover the evacuation transport. Hess acknowledged it. No one on the floor below suggested that the Halvern pull back. No one said the cruiser had done enough. The Halvern was damaged, and there were 41 civilians on a transport that needed 14 more minutes to clear the engagement zone, and the Halvern stayed exactly where it was for 14 minutes. The transport cleared. The pirate faction withdrew. The Halvern reported 11 injured crew. Serious, but not critical across all cases. One of the patrol vessels had taken damage to its drive that would need repair before it could move under its own power. The medical courier had already changed course toward both vessels before anyone asked it to. On the operations floor, there was no celebration. People moved to the next task, assessing damage, coordinating recovery, handling the cascade of things that followed an engagement. It looked less like a victory response and more like cleanup after a long day of work. Hess stood still for a moment in the center of all of it. Then she turned and looked up at the observation level. She looked directly at the 3 of them, and Nara understood that Hess had known they were there the entire time. The Admiral walked to the stairs and came up to the observation level and stopped in front of them. She was shorter than all 3 of them by a significant margin. She looked at each of them once, not assessing, just looking. "The people on that transport," she said, were biologists and geologists and 2 cartographers. No military value. No strategic assets. Nothing on Verent that we couldn't have rebuilt in a year. She looked out at the operations floor below. 11 of my people are injured tonight because of a decision I made that any honest tactical analysis would call inefficient. She was quiet for a moment. I would make it again in under a second, she said, and walked back down the stairs. Nara stood at the railing and looked at the display below, the lines of movement still visible, the transport now safe, the Halvern holding position while the medical courier approached. Orin was standing very still beside her. Breck had his hands on the railing and was looking at something that was not the display. Nara thought about what Daven had said, about the thing that did not have a metric, about watching what humans did when someone they cared about was in danger, about watching whether they stopped. She had watched. She was beginning to understand. Diplomat Sol arrived the next morning. He came through the docking corridor with 2 aides in a posture that announced he was not pleased before he said a single word. He was a tall Dracaran, gray-scaled at the edges where age had touched him, with careful eyes and the particular kind of controlled stillness that high-ranking diplomats developed after years of situations where showing the wrong thing at the wrong moment cost something irreplaceable. Nara knew that posture. She had grown up under it. He stopped in front of the 3 of them in the corridor outside the Youth Exchange residential block and looked at each of them in the order of their offense, which put Nara first and Orin last with a slightly lighter version of the look. An unauthorized entry into a restricted area. The use of technical skills to bypass a military-grade security system. The presence of 3 non-authorized individuals in an active operations zone during a compact emergency response. He had the formal complaint documentation ready. He told them this. Nara let him finish. She had been thinking since she left the observation level the night before, and she had arranged what she wanted to say, and she waited for the space to say it. When he paused, she asked him one question. She asked, if that had been a Dracaran transport, 41 Dracaran civilians with no military value and no strategic assets, in the same position, facing the same threat, would the Dracaran fleet have sent a cruiser with a flagged shielding system and 7 civilian vessels to take fire for them? Diplomat Sol looked at her. The look changed. Not much, just slightly. The controlled stillness shifted in a way that Nara recognized because she had learned to read him early, the same way you learn to read weather on a world where weather could kill you, carefully and with complete attention. He did not answer. That was, as Orin had predicted quietly to Nara before Sol arrived, its own answer. Sol sent the aides away. He stood in the corridor with the 3 of them and was quiet for a moment that went on long enough to become significant, and then he said that he needed to speak to the station's human administrators. Not about the formal complaint, about other things. He asked Nara to come with him. Then, after a pause, he told Breck and Orin to come as well. Daven was already in the meeting room when they arrived. He was sitting at the table with a container of something hot and a look of mild, genuine interest, the expression of someone who had been curious how a particular situation would resolve. Admiral Hess arrived 4 minutes after Sol, sat down across from him, and put her hands flat on the table and waited. Sol said, I want to understand what happened last night. Hess said, which part? The part where you risked a cruiser for civilians with no strategic value, Sol said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Hess looked at him for a moment and then looked at Daven, and something passed between them that was not a conversation but was communication, the kind that happens between people who have worked alongside each other long enough that certain things no longer need to be said aloud. Daven turned his container slowly on the table. How would you like me to explain it, he asked. Strategically? Culturally? Historically? Honestly, Sol said. Daven nodded. Then he said, Admiral Hess did not send the Halvern because those 41 people had value to the compact. She sent it because they are people, and people in danger is a sufficient reason. He paused. I understand that this is not how most species in the compact approach resource allocation in emergency response. I understand that the calculus most governing bodies use involves a meaningful distinction between essential and non-essential populations. Sol said, quietly, we do not make that distinction based on sentiment. I know, Daven said. Neither do we. Sol looked at him. That is a contradiction. No, Daven said. The distinction you make is based on utility. The distinction we don't make is also based on something consistent and logical. We just use a different starting point. He looked at his hands for a moment. Every human being exists inside a web of other human beings. Family, community, colleagues, strangers who share a station or a ship or a street. We have organized ourselves around that web for so long that protecting any part of it has stopped feeling like a calculation and started feeling like a reflex. He looked up. The 41 people on Verant were strangers to Admiral Hess. That is irrelevant. They were human. They were in the web. Sol was quiet. Hess said, "The thing that your daughter saw last night was not exceptional by our standards. It was standard response. We would do it for any human population in any circumstance." She paused. "We would also do it for non-human populations, which has come up 4 times in the last 12 years, and all 4 times the result was the same." Sol turned to look at Nara. She met his eyes. She thought about what she wanted to say and decided to say it plainly. She told him that she had spent the first day of the exchange program deciding that humans were small and limited and not very interesting. She told him that she had then opened a door she was not supposed to open and found something that did not fit any of those conclusions. She told him that she had stood on the observation level and watched 11 humans get injured protecting people they had never met, and that she had heard Admiral Hess say she would do it again without hesitation, and that she had believed her, not because it was a diplomatic statement, but because every piece of evidence she had encountered in the last 2 days supported it. She told her father, "I did not know what humans were. I do not think you do either." Sol sat with that for a long time. Then he asked Daven, "Why have you not said any of this in 40 years of Compact membership? Why do the official profiles describe your species in terms of developing potential and limited current capability?" Daven said, "Because developing potential and limited current capability is accurate. We are not misrepresenting ourselves. We are genuinely limited in most of the ways those profiles suggest. The things that are not limited are not the kinds of things that translate well into compact assessment formats." He looked at Sol directly. "And because, 40 years ago, we were very new. We needed time to understand the shape of the space we had joined before we started explaining ourselves in it." Sol asked, "And now?" Daven looked at him steadily and said, "I think someone opened a door." The room was quiet. Sol looked at the formal complaint documentation he had brought with him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned it over on the table so the text faced down. "I will be requesting a series of non-standard diplomatic sessions," he said. "Not public, not formal. Conversations between my office and the human delegation for the purpose of developing a more accurate understanding of your species profile." He looked at Hess. "I would like to start with the full after-action documentation from last night's response." Hess said, "I'll have it sent to your office today." Sol stood. He looked at Nara once more. She could not read exactly what was in the look. It was too layered, too many things at once, but one of the things in it was something that she did not see from him often. He left the room without saying anything else. Oren waited until the door closed, then said to Nara, very quietly, "He is going to tell your clutch siblings about this." Nara said, "I know." Breck said, "Is that a good thing?" Nara looked at the closed door. She thought about the Halvarin holding position with damaged shielding. She thought about 11 people who went home injured and would go again if asked. "I think so," she said. The last 9 days of the exchange program passed differently than the first. Nara stopped standing in corners at the edge of the human quarter. She started walking into the middle of things, which turned out to be the only way to see them properly. She shadowed Daven on his maintenance rounds for 3 days in a row, not because station maintenance was interesting in itself, but because watching Daven work had started to feel like reading a language she was slowly learning to recognize. He fixed things with whatever was available. He improvised without drama. He spoke to the equipment the way some people spoke to animals, not expecting a response, just finding it easier to work with something if you addressed it directly. On the 4th day she asked him about it, and he thought about it for a moment and said it was probably just habit. Then he said, "Actually no, it was because every system he worked on had been built by someone, and talking to it was a way of staying aware that there had been a mind behind the design, which made it easier to understand what had gone wrong." Nara thought about that for a long time afterward. Breck attended every human cultural session he had skipped in the first 3 days. He came back from the first one looking unsettled, and from the second one looking thoughtful, and from the third one, looking like someone who had been given a piece of information that did not fit neatly into any category he had, and was now considering building a new one. He told Nara that humans had hundreds of different spoken languages on a single planet at one point in their history, and that many of those languages had survived the development of a common tongue, and that humans seemed to maintain them not because they were required to, but because the languages were attached to something they did not want to lose. He said he could not find the word for what that something was. Not in Dracarin. Orin spent most of the remaining 9 days in the station's archive section, reading. She did not say much about what she was reading. Orin never said much when she was processing something large. She got very still and very quiet, and the quality of her attention became something you could almost see. Near the end of the exchange program, she told Nara that she was going to write about humans. Not a diplomatic summary or a compact assessment report. Something more careful than that. She was going to do it properly, she said, which would take time, because doing it properly meant finding the right words, and some of the right words did not exist yet in Dracarin and would need to be built. On the last day of the exchange program, Daven met all 3 of them at the docking corridor. He had a small object for each of them, a standard data chip of the kind used for personal file transfer. Unremarkable, no markings. He handed them over without ceremony. Nara looked at the chip and then at him. The open access training logs, he said, and the mountain run footage, in case you want to show anyone. He paused. Also a contact frequency, if you ever want to ask questions. Breck held his chip and said, "Is this authorized?" Daven said, "It's public record. Anyone in the compact can access it. I just put it in a more convenient format." Orin said, "You have been doing this for a while, giving people the convenient format." Daven smiled, the small one that was not proud and not sharp, just present. Someone has to. They left Cradle Point on a Dracarin diplomatic transport. Nara sat at the observation port and watched the station fall behind them and thought about doors. About which ones were locked, and which ones only looked locked, and what happened when someone young and too curious and slightly reckless decided to find out which was which. She fell asleep before they cleared the approach corridor. 1 year later, the Dracarin Compact delegation issued a formal policy revision. The language was careful and administrative and said exactly what it needed to say, without saying much that was visible, the way diplomatic documents often worked. It reclassified humanity's standing within the compact from protected developing species to full peer partner, which was a phrase that sounded mild and was not. It meant different consultation rights, different resource access, different weight in joint decisions. The press summary attributed it to updated strategic assessments following a detailed diplomatic review. The 3 Dracarin who had spent 2 weeks on Cradle Point Station were not mentioned anywhere in the official record. Nara did not expect to be mentioned. That was not how these things worked. She received a short message from Daven Cole 3 days after the revision was published. It had no subject line. The body of the message contained 4 words. "Nice work. Good start." She replied with 2 words. "Your turn." He did not respond to that, which she had not expected him to. He was already doing whatever the next thing was. That seemed to be how Daven worked. 5 years after the exchange program, Nara Sul was a junior diplomat assigned to an independent world at the edge of compact mapped space. The world was called Drev, and it was facing a resource crisis of the kind that happened slowly until it happened fast, a convergence of failed harvests and infrastructure decay and a population that had grown past what the existing systems could comfortably support. The compact response was coordinated, multiple species contributing what they could. Dracarin delegations handling the formal negotiations, others handling logistics and medical supply chains. The humans were handling the physical delivery. The first aid convoy arrived 12 hours after Nara reached Drev. She was at the main docking bay when it came in. The convoy was 7 vessels, civilian transports with aid cargo markings, and when the crews came off the ships to begin unloading, there were humans in the mix, but also Dracarin dockworkers who had been assigned to the receiving end, and the 2 groups looked at each other for a moment and then got to work. It was raining on Drev, a steady, cold rain that made the docking bay surfaces slick. The humans unloaded in the rain without complaint and without making a particular point of not complaining, simply working, and the Dracarin dockworkers worked alongside them. And after about 20 minutes, Nara noticed that no one in the bay was thinking about the 2 groups separately anymore. They were just the unloading crew. Breck was standing beside her. He was working toward a compact mediation certification now, spending time in different conflict and crisis zones, learning the shape of how things broke and how they were put back together. He had arrived on Drev the day before her, which was like him. He watched the bay and said, "I still do not entirely understand them." Nara said, "I do not think that is the point." Breck looked at her. "What is the point?" Nara watched a human crew member hand a crate to a Dracaran dockworker who was better positioned to move it, and the Dracaran take it without the half-second hesitation that would have been there 5 years ago, and both of them move on immediately to the next thing. "The point," she said, "is to stop thinking that understanding them completely is a requirement for working alongside them." Breck thought about that. Then he said, "Oren would say that is an intellectually unsatisfying position. Oren would find a better way to say the same thing." Breck almost smiled. They watched the bay for a while longer. The rain kept coming down. The work kept going. Oren's paper was published in the Compact Academic Exchange 3 years after the Drev assignment. It was long and careful and had taken her 4 years to write, which was how long it took to build some of the words she had needed. The Dracaran academic community received it with the particular combination of interest and discomfort that serious work often generated, when it said something true that people had been comfortable not thinking about. The final section of the paper was later quoted more than any other part, not in academic circles, but in diplomatic ones, in briefings and policy discussions, and the kinds of conversations that happened in rooms without cameras. It was quoted because it said something that needed saying, and said it in a way that was hard to argue with. Oren had stared at the opening line of that final section for a long time before she wrote it. She had the right words by then. She had built them carefully and tested them, and was satisfied that they were accurate. She still paused, not because she doubted them, but because she knew what they would do once they were out in the world. She wrote the line. It read, "They are not strong. They were never strong. That is precisely why nothing about them should be underestimated." Below it she wrote the explanation that unpacked 4 years of research into the nature of human social bonding, collective identity, and the particular form of durability that came not from individual power, but from the refusal to treat any member of the group as expendable. She wrote about the rescue at Verint in clinical terms and what the response pattern revealed about human decision architecture. She wrote about the things that did not translate into compact assessment formats, and why they did not, and what was lost in that gap. She wrote, "The 40 years during which humanity was considered unremarkable were not years of human limitation. They were years of incomplete observation. The observers were looking for the wrong things." She sent the final draft to Nara and Breck before submission, as she had sent every draft. Nara read it in one sitting. She sent back 2 words, "Send it." Breck's note was longer. He wrote that the paper was correct and important, and also that he was grateful it had been written by someone with more patience than him, because he would not have gotten the words right. Oren submitted the paper. The compact did not change overnight. Large things did not change overnight. They changed the way water moved through stone, which was slowly and without announcement, and with results that became visible only when you looked back from far enough away. The results were visible to Nara and Breck and Oren because they knew what to look for and where to look and when the change had started. It had started with a door in a maintenance corridor on a station called Cradle Point. It had started with a human engineer with gray at his temples who sat down on a padded floor and talked to 3 young Dracaran who had not yet learned to listen. It had started with a question about what humans did when someone they loved was in trouble. The galaxy was still learning the answer. It was not done learning yet. But it had started, and starting was the part that nothing could undo.